It's great to be able to gather in this way. Who would have known a year ago that would not be the only Easter weekend that we would need to be meeting virtually online as church. None of us could have predicted that, really, could we? And we've often heard this word, unprecedented, haven't we? It's not used quite so much nowadays. But certainly in the early weeks and months of the pandemic, this term unprecedented was used an awful lot. And of course, whilst the reality is the current crisis is in some senses unprecedented, in the sense that it's the first time in this current generation that we've experienced a pandemic of these proportions. Human history, modern history even, is full of examples of pandemics, and people look back to the Spanish flu of the early 20th century, not that long away, and so it's a term that in some senses is helpful, but the events that we're celebrating this morning as we think about the death and particularly the resurrection of Jesus on that first Easter morning are truly unprecedented. They are unique in all of human history. And of course, that's one of the reasons why Jesus Christ is unique, why Christianity is unique, why Jesus is distinctive amongst all the other founders of spiritual movements and religions. He alone rose from the grave. That is entirely unprecedented. And he is therefore, of course, very much alive, which is why being a Christian is not looking back on some historical figure who left us some teaching to follow. It's about having a daily living relationship with him. And as we've been worshipping this morning, we've been enjoying, I trust, his living presence with us. He is among us. He's imminently among us, and we walk in relationship with him. We enjoy his presence. We hear his voice. We embrace his kingdom into our lives, and we participate with him in his mission. And we've had some readings from John's Gospel this morning that describe the events of the first Easter morning, the day of resurrection, and those accounts in the Gospels are full of interesting details. I love to just notice the little details in the different accounts. And of course, the Gospels, the four Gospels, are in some sense selective reports. They're not just neutral, factual records. They are written with particular audiences in mind, and they're written therefore to communicate and emphasize certain things, and sometimes the details that the gospel writers include and choose to omit reflect that intention of who they're writing to. And that is also true of the accounts of the resurrection that we have in the Gospels. And so some of the details that John includes, for example, that we've read, the other gospel writers don't include. Now some would see that and recognize that and conclude that that's a reason why this is all just a sham and it's all just made up. They would interpret that as being contradictory. I would actually claim that underlines the authenticity of these accounts. The reality is, of course, in any ongoing investigation, if you have different witnesses of an event and they all completely agree and present the same version of events, and they all mention the same details as they're recounting those events, then actually your suspicions are raised to the fact that there's been some fabrication, there's been some collusion that's going on. And that's not what we find in the accounts of our Gospels, and it's not what we find in the account of the resurrection itself. And so the differences in the Gospel accounts reflect the fact that these events are simply being experienced by different witnesses and then written down with a particular purpose in mind. So let's just reflect on some of the details of John's account of the resurrection. What do they tell us about the significance as we're celebrating what Christ has done for us this morning? The first detail, of course, that is recorded in all the other accounts is this, and that's the first day. It was on the first day at dawn that the women found the empty tomb, and that Peter and John then subsequently find the empty tomb. This is the day after the Sabbath. Now let's just pause and think about that, because there's significance here. It's not just incidental. It's not a random day. It is the first day, because that means something. Now the Jews, of course, as ourselves, followed a 7-day calendar. And like everything else for the Jew, that was rooted in spiritual realities and full of spiritual significance. And of course it was rooted in the account of Genesis chapter 1, where our Bibles begin. It's rooted in the creation account there that is presented in Genesis 1 and then formalized in the law of Moses. The Bible begins with the account of God creating the cosmos that we live in and that we inhabit. And God does that, according to Genesis, in a cycle of 7 days. And it all begins with the first day. And this is how Genesis records that first day. It says, "And God said, 'Let there be light.' And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning." The first day. That's where the whole of creation begins, and where the entire cosmos itself has its beginnings. Now fast forward to John chapter 20 and the events that John describes, and we find another first day. As the first light of dawn is just beginning to glimmer and break out and flood this garden within which the tomb is, where Jesus' body has been laid. It's a new day. It's the first day. It's the new cycle of 7 days that's beginning, that harks back to Genesis. And what we have here then is an echo of the first creation and a sign for us that a whole new creation is breaking out and beginning in the cosmos. A new creation that will ultimately, of course, have no sun and no moon, because God and Christ himself will be its light. And the resurrected body of Jesus is the first piece of that whole new cosmos, that whole new creation. A new heavens and a new earth are on their way, and Christ's resurrected body is the very first piece of that new future creation. Paul describes it, the resurrection, as the first fruits. It's like the green shoots that signal that the harvest is most certainly to come. A harvest that includes you and me in Christ. If we've died with him, we will surely be raised with him. So that's the first sign. Then another sign we find, the stone rolled away from the grave. Another little detail that's recorded for us. It's a little hard for us maybe to imagine. Our experience, of course, when a person dies and the procedures that happen once a person in our own culture dies is quite different from what would have happened in that world of the Middle East. For us, of course, it's usually a coffin, it's a crematorium, it's a curtain, and it's flowers. But for a first century Jew in the Middle East, it would have been a stone chamber. It would have been burial cloths. It would have been aromatic spices. And it would have been a massive stone that was rolled over the tomb to seal and secure the chamber itself. It was called the blocking stone. And it acted like a cork in a bottle at the entrance to the chamber. And it was a massive, hefty stone, sometimes disc-shaped so it could be rolled more easily. But it would have weighed, some people, archaeologists, estimate between 1 and 2 tons. Now, I don't know if you've ever ordered a ton bag of ballast or sand or something, you know, one of those massive Hippo ton bags. I had a few of those arrive at the end of last year as I was beginning to lay a slab for the cabin that we've put up in the garden. they're not even a ton, I don't think, but they are heavy. Now, you try and move one of those bags all by yourself. It's impossible. And so actually Mark's gospel records how the women on their way to the tomb are mulling over this problem in their minds. How are we going to move the stone? It was a serious piece of rock that would have required at least a couple of hefty blokes to shift. I don't know if you've ever enjoyed watching the World's Strongest Man. You'll know that one of the elements of the competition is the Atlas stones, where they lift up those stones that are progressively more and more heavy. Well, one of the largest Atlas stones weighs apparently 160 kilos. That's about 350 pounds. Well, the stone that would have sealed the tomb would have weighed between 2,000 and 4,000 pounds. That's one reason why, of course, the theory that Jesus revived within the tomb and pushed back the stone from the inside to secure his escape is a ridiculous notion. This wasn't the kind of stone that could be shifted by a man on his own. Not even Eddie Hall, the world's strongest man, could move a stone like this, let alone someone who has been through the equivalent of a near fatal car accident with all the catastrophic blood loss that would have involved. No, this is another sign for us that there is some element of divine power and intervention at work in the resurrection. A power and an energy from heaven itself, whether directly, whether through angels. This marks and points to divine intervention. That's what we're celebrating in the resurrection. That God raised Christ. He intervened. The resurrection speaks of God acting and intervening then powerfully to reverse death itself. The next sign is the women witnesses. All the Gospels actually record this, that despite being written by men, it was very clearly an important feature that they thought there was value in recording and drawing attention to. John mentions Mary Magdalene, but the other Gospels mention another Mary alongside of her, Mary, the mother of James and Salome. And Luke's Gospel also mentions a third woman called Joanna, who was somehow involved as one of the first witnesses. And so it's these women who were the first to to head off to the tomb. And their plan, of course, is to express devotion and honor to this Jesus by packing more spices into the linen shroud that his corpse has been wrapped in, despite the very dangerous, precarious situation that they're living in. It's the women that show courage and devotion and who take the lead, as it were. And as a result, they are the first ones in the whole of human history to witness the resurrected Jesus and then to share that good news with others. Now, John, of course, homes in on this character, Mary Magdalene, and elsewhere the Bible describes her as a woman from whom 7 demons have been driven out by Jesus himself. Now, a lot of people in history have tried to fill in the gaps, and there's been a bit of a myth of Mary Magdalene created. There's not a great deal of detail in the Gospels, but what's clear is that this is a woman who's had a dramatic encounter with Jesus and has been set free from severe oppression. Her life has been radically changed, and she's become part of the group of disciples that traveled around with Jesus on his mission, one of the very first witnesses of the resurrection and a herald of good news. There's another sign here in the women witnesses. It's the sign that speaks of the nature of God's kingdom that's marked by the resurrection, a kingdom that actually overturns and reverses many of the traditional power structures of society, a kingdom that brings freedom from oppression, a kingdom that brings dignity to those who are oppressed. A third sign. And then we have the empty grave clothes. I love this little detail. John records how Mary Magdalene rushes back and tells Peter and John what she's seen. And then there's this foot race between Peter and John. I love the way that John, just can't resist recording that he's the one that ran the fastest and got to the tomb first. He feels the need to include this in his account, doesn't he? And then he describes that he, having reached the tomb, stops at the entrance. That may be out of respect. It may be out of a fear of what he's going to find inside. But then we have good old Peter who arrives. And of course, Peter, being Peter, he doesn't hesitate. He doesn't stop. He goes straight on in. I mean, he just acts first and then he thinks later, doesn't he? And he sees the empty shroud that the body was wrapped in, and then a separate piece of cloth that would have been wrapped around the head, folded up in another place. And John then enters, and we read in his account that was the moment that he believed. He sees the grave clothes, and in that instance, he grasps the significance of what he sees, and he believes. And this little description of the grave clothes, I think, is fascinating. There is order here in the tomb. You see, this is not a scene that reflects something chaotic and haphazard having happened. It's not a scene that speaks of a sudden resuscitation and then a struggle to tear open the shroud and rip off the headpiece in a rush to escape or go and find help. No, there's no panic here at all. Quite the opposite. There is the evidence of composure. There's the evidence of peace. There's what the Hebrews call shalom, God's order, God's peace. You know, quite often the state of our external environment can reflect the internal state of our souls. Well, there's no chaos here in the tomb. All there is shalom. The person who rises from the grave and then takes time to fold up his own grave clothes is the one who embodies God's shalom and who is establishing God's order. That's Jesus. The grave clothes themselves, of course, obviously also speak of death. They're equivalent to what we might know as a body bag today. Here in the tomb, the grave clothes, they're discarded. They're no longer needed. They can be put to one side. It's a sign, isn't it, for us that death has now finally been undone. The last enemy has been irreversibly defeated, put to one side. Jesus has secured for us a future where death has no place. Grave clothes can now be discarded. As Paul puts it, death is swallowed up in victory. Oh, death, where is your victory? Death, where is your sting? Hallelujah. The grave has been overcome. And then just a couple more little details. Tears wiped away. Mary doesn't get it to start with, does she? She assumes that someone's removed the corpse and she's overwhelmed with sadness. She's distraught. I mean, she's come to honor the person of Jesus by wrapping these spices into the grave clothes. And suddenly she discovers what she thinks is a very shameful act has happened. Someone's unwrapped the corpse and has stolen the corpse. And so she's just overcome. She stands outside the tomb. She begins to sob. And the angels ask her why she's sobbing. And then Jesus himself approaches her. And he also asks her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" Right before her eyes, of course, there's the very reason to be the happiest woman alive. Everything that she's assuming, of course, and worrying about, and deeply distraught about, and depressed by, it's just not true. What is true is that Jesus is alive, and she can now wipe her tears away. There's no longer a reason for sorrow or hopelessness. The resurrection has changed all that for her, and the resurrection has changed all that for you and for me. Hallelujah. Grief and sorrow in the face of death, of course, is a very real, painful part of our human experience in this age. And over the past year or so, There's been plenty of that at this difficult time. Jesus himself in his humanity experienced that. Jesus wept is the way the gospel records his response to the news that a close friend had died. But here on the morning of a new day, a new first day, there's a sign that in the new creation, all of our tears will be wiped away. That's what we have to look forward to. The end of grief and sorrow that's associated with death. Revelation says he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. And death shall be no more. No, neither shall there be mourning or crying or pain any more, for the former things have passed away. And then one final little detail is this, a father to come home to. Jesus then sends Mary back to the disciples with these words. Just listen to these words. Go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. What an announcement. It's a sign, isn't it, that we've now been reconciled to God on the basis of this death and this resurrection. And that reconciliation, incredibly, goes beyond being counted not guilty. It goes beyond being forgiven. It includes also being adopted by the Father into a brand new family, so that Jesus becomes our brother and God himself becomes our Abba. Like the prodigal son, humanity, of course, has squandered everything that it's been given by virtue of creation and sunk into very deep depravity. But now we can be welcomed back home again into the Father's arms and into the Father's house. So what an unprecedented event this is. When Jesus rose, everything changed. That's why we celebrate. That's why we look for opportunities to tell others this incredible good news. This really is unprecedented, unparalleled good news that we're celebrating. I tell you, it's much better news than the news of a vaccine. It's much better news than the news of an end to lockdown. If those things make you feel a glimmer of joy and hope and happiness, how much more should this resurrection event fill our lives with deep hope and joy at what God has done for Christ and at what we have to look forward to as a result. God's powerful intervention, death defeated, tears wiped away, and a wonderful Father to